Hi, it's Dwyer, folks. It's the day of the fight. Moses Atama is unbeaten. Moses Atama is the top ranked contender for a sanctioning body, and he's fighting Dillian White. Let's give some final thoughts. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Folks, here's some things to consider. Right? Let's pause for a moment. I understand the public narrative. There's always a public narrative. Makes Moses Atama look like he is the next big thing in boxing. Some of the people who have endorsed him as being the next big thing are heavyweight champion Alexander Usyk, former heavyweight champion Tyson Fury. Folks, those are big people. According to reports, Moses Atama has been sparring with people like Tyson Fury in the background, right? So Atama in practice has been in the ring with some elite fighters. He's highly thought of. There are guys who have hopped in the ring with him. Lawrence Okolie, the former cruiserweight champion, the former bridgerweight champion, who is now a heavyweight. And they're talking about his prodigious punching power. Right? The key question is whether he'll be able to deal with, let's be blunt, an experience gap here. Let me make another point too, and this one will sound controversial. There are some athletes who are always on their A game, right? You might remember the hurdler in track and field, Edwin Moses, right? At one point, he had won something like 100 straight races, right? There are those professionals who always come in, and whoever they're fighting, they're on their A game. But you have a lot of people. Let's face it, life is more complicated. You have a lot of people who, if they view their opponent as a C-level opponent, they'll come in with their B game to beat them. Right? They aren't always at their best. You know, Muhammad Ali lost to Ken Norton. Got his jaw broken. I was just researching that fight. And in the post-fight interview, Ali actually apologized to the fans, if you could believe this. And he said that he had underestimated Kenny Norton and hadn't fully trained. I'm talking about one of the all-time greats. Right? That happens in boxing. Be careful. Be careful if you're going to judge Dillian White by some of his recent fights. Now let's look at Dillian White's 3 losses. Right, folks? Would it shock you to know that all 3 guys that Dillian White lost to at one point in their careers was heavyweight champion? He lost to Anthony Joshua. He lost in a fight where he knocks down Povetkin. He lost to Alexander Povetkin. He lost to Tyson Fury. Those are his 3 losses. Folks, he's beaten everyone else. His wins include wins over guys who have fought for the heavyweight title or have fought former champions. Right? Derek Chisora fought multiple times for the heavyweight title. Right? Vitaly Klitschko. Chisora went the distance against him. You might remember Derek Chisora's fights, plural, against Tyson Fury. Right? Understand. Right now, Kubrat Pulev has a share of the heavyweight title. Granted, it's a minor share, but Chisora has fought him. Understand, right now, one of the esteemed contenders a guy who beat Makhmudov and beat Zhili Zhang, beat Frank Sanchez, Ajit Kabayel. Derek Chisora fought him. Understand, Dillian White fought Derek Chisora twice, went the distance, 12 rounds with Chisora in one fight, got the stoppage in the 11th round in the other fight. Right? Let me say this too. Dillian White has beaten guys who have been heavyweight champion. I mentioned Alexander Povetkin earlier. Understand, Dillian White drops Povetkin. Povetkin gets off the canvas. White may have gotten a little bit too excited over dropping Povetkin. White ends up getting dropped himself. In the rematch, White stops Povetkin, a guy who, in his career, has been heavyweight champion. Right now, top contender, Joe Parker. He's a sanctioning body's mandatory contender. Got dropped legitimately by Dillian White in a fight, right? There are two knockdowns. One I thought was a forearm. We can debate it, right? But understand, Parker hits the canvas legitimately against Dillian White. Parker, of course, had been heavyweight champion in the past, right? He lost his title to Anthony Joshua, who, of course, Dillian White also fought. And, of course, Dillian White fought Tyson Fury. Dillian White fought Anthony Joshua. Let's do the math. That's 4 guys who have held the heavyweight title at some point in their careers who Dillian White has fought. And, of course, White beat 2 of them in fights involving either a stoppage in the Povetkin case or a knockdown. In the Joe Parker case, understand, Dillian White goes 12 rounds with Joe Parker. Right? Now, Moses Atama, and I understand, he sparred with some boxing dignitaries, right? I understand he has a reputation for heavy hands. I understand he's unbeaten as I make this video with a very high knockout percentage. But let's look at the actual resume, not the sparring stories, right? Just understand that Atama, the most he's gone in a fight, the most. And he's fighting Dillian White today. It's fight day. The most Atama has gone is 6 rounds in a fight. 6. Now, while Dillian White's fighting people like Povetkin, Parker, Fury, Joshua, in real fights, not just sparring sessions, right? Real fights. Just understand the 2 guys who went the distance with Moses Atama are Kevin Espindola and Kastiantu Dobyshenko. Those are the 2 guys who went 6 rounds with Moses Atama. It's important here. I want people to look at the betting spreads. You ask yourself whether the public's making some assumptions in coming up with those betting odds. Then ask yourself the harder question: are the assumptions justified? Let me also make a point too. You know, boxing actually involves more than the 2 fighters, right? The guy in Dillian White's corner, Buddy McGurt, is a Hall of Famer. Let me point out that you see some fighters, and then suddenly you see them putting on unusual performances against pretty good competition. You say, wow, I haven't really seen this guy fight this way, fight this style. I wouldn't have expected the guy to be this effective in this fight. In moments like that, I really believe viewers need to, at the end of the round, look in the guy's corner. In other words, the camera usually catches the guy walking back to his corner. You need to look in the corner. You might find that the guy has a new trainer. Sometimes the trainer is an absolute magician. Let's talk about two such times. Right? Sergei Kovalev, slugger. Understand, that was his trademark. Slugger. He stopped opponents. Understand, he hit so hard. There's a fight where his opponent unfortunately died after the fight. He's that hard a puncher. Right? He had a fight against another slugger, Anthony Yarde. Right? Anthony Yarde is so dangerous, folks. He's the next opponent for David Benavidez. Right? Think this through. Anthony Yarde, of course, has also fought Arthur Beterbiev. Well, when Kovalev fought Anthony Yarde, the trainer in Kovalev's corner was Buddy McGurt. Know that name. Again, he's a Hall of Famer. Great fighter. Now he's a trainer. Right, folks? I encourage people, particularly those who followed Kovalev's career over the years, to look at the Kovalev who showed up that night. Right? Somehow, and it's a mystery, right? It's a credit to Buddy McGurt, who's now training Dillian White. Somehow, McGurt, in a fight in Kovalev's backyard, in other words, you would have thought Kovalev in front of his fans would be Kovalev. Buddy McGurt convinced Kovalev to stay off the ropes and to actually make the fight a boxing match, not a slugfest. In other words, you had Slugger A against Slugger B. The showcase in that fight, and it's a showcase, is Kovalev's jab. Buddy McGurt had Kovalev shooting a jab against Anthony Yarde. Folks, Kovalev won the fight. That's the kind of fight where after the fight you want to have a gold medal. You want to, in fact, have a couple of gold medals. Put one around the fighter's neck, right? The fighter's the one actually executing the game plan. You also wanted to put one on Buddy McGurt. Right? There's certain fights where you say, wow, this trainer's on his game. Let's name another. Buddy McGurt weighed 175. He was fighting a guy 168. Think about it, 168. Coming up to fight the reigning champion in the higher weight class. Right? The guy coming up, Canelo. Buddy McGurt's guy, Kovalev. Believe it or not, look at the film. Look at the film. No one announces this. You have to be watching the fight, wondering what the guys are going to do, then observing what the guys are doing. Somehow Buddy McGurt convinced Kovalev, who was a slugger. Right? No one thought of Kovalev as Mr. Back Foot. Kovalev was the guy who finished guys, not who danced and boxed. Somehow, Buddy McGurt, the trainer, convinced Kovalev in a fight that has to be on the short list for Terence Crawford in terms of figuring out what he can do against Canelo. Somehow, McGurt convinced Kovalev to box Canelo. Folks, as I sit here, it's one of the best fights I've seen against Canelo. Right? There are parts of that fight where Kovalev, on his back foot, is outboxing Canelo. Right? Think about the level of preparation it took to come up with that game plan. Somebody, I believe it's Buddy McGurt, sat down looked at Canelo films, knowing that his man's bigger, looked at Canelo films and came to the conclusion that the way to beat Saul Alvarez was by boxing and circling. Then Buddy McGurt made sure that his man, a flat-footed slugger, had those skills. Right? Understand, the Kovalev-Canelo fight, again, is one of the best fights against Canelo. Right? We'll put it there, apart from the fights Canelo lost, right? Mayweather, Bivol. We'll put it there with the Erislandy Lara fight, for example, where Lara's on his back foot, outboxing Canelo. I'm hearing that Crawford has closed his camp. He doesn't want the press sniffing around, seeing what his strategy is. What's the point? We already know that Crawford, well, I think I know, that Crawford has to fight like Lara, like Kovalev. In other words, Crawford is going to fight the fight he fought against Victor Postal. Right? I don't have to be at Crawford sparring sessions to know that. Right? Because I know Crawford doesn't have the power to stay in the pocket against a guy who's 3 weight classes above Crawford's last knockout. Right? So let me just say, another Buddy McGurt classic, recent fight. Buddy McGurt is now Callum Smith's trainer. Look at the Callum Smith-Joshua Buatsi fight. Right? Understand, Callum Smith is not moving away from Buatsi. But Callum Smith, who likes to be flat-footed, is moving more than Callum Smith normally moves. Right? Callum Smith is a guy who, at the end of the day, decided to have a shootout with Arthur Beterbiev in the closing rounds of that fight. Understand, Buddy McGurt has Callum Smith doing some new things. Well, you have that experienced trainer, Buddy McGurt, in Dillian White's corner. Right? I mean, understand, not only is there an experience gap, one guy fighting multiple heavyweight champions, guys who've been heavyweight champions. Right? One guy fighting tough guys, Derek Chisora, twice, Robert Helenius, who've been in with heavyweight champions. One guy who has gone past 6 rounds. Hell, he's gone 12 rounds against tough competition like Joe Parker. Right? Derek Chisora. And of course, in that guy's corner, you have one of boxing's best trainers, a tactician, a guy who's convincing his bigger fighter to box a 168-pounder who's come into the division. By the way, that should tell you Canelo's punching power. You had a trainer talking with his 175-pound champion who was a slugger. And the game plan they came up with after studying and preparing for the fight was to move away from Canelo. That's how hard Canelo hits. So let me just say, folks, maybe Atama is the next best thing to sliced bread. Maybe this is a paradigm shift. I remember the 1980s. I remember we thought Mike Tyson was a paradigm shift. Tyson wasn't even using a jab. He was coming in and destroying opponents. He beat some seasoned guys. Michael Spinks, Hall of Famer. Spinks, by the way, only lost once. That was that Mike Tyson fight. Had beaten Larry Holmes twice. Tyson beat Larry Holmes. We thought he was a paradigm shift. What ultimately beat Tyson? Wasn't that a jab Buster Douglas was throwing? Wasn't Buster Douglas targeting Tyson's eyes? Didn't Tyson have a swollen eye? Wasn't that a layered approach Buster Douglas used? And Douglas is interesting because understand, Douglas is that prototypical guy who had some fights where you thought, wow, this guy's damn good. But then had some fights where he faded. In other words, this is your high variance guy. Catch him on the wrong day and he can beat anyone. Mike Tyson caught Buster Douglas on the wrong day. Douglas hits the canvas against Tyson, gets off the canvas, isn't discouraged, drops Tyson. Folks, that's a stoppage. Then we get to the 90s, right? Tyson continues fighting. Then we notice Tyson has problems against other elite fighters. Wasn't that Tyson struggling twice against Evander Holyfield? Then you started to realize, you know what? For a stretch, it looked like Tyson was a paradigm shift. But maybe he wasn't that far ahead of the rest of the world. Moses Atama right now in betting markets is being priced as if he's that far ahead of the rest of the world. Right? It might shock some people. The over-under in this fight is under 5. Right, folks? Two guys who I just named who I'm sure most of the crowd here have never heard of have gone 6 rounds with Moses Atama. Let me also say, too, and I don't mean to pick on Atama, right? But at a certain point, the empire strikes back, right? At a certain point, you realize that there's a value to experience against opponents like Povetkin, Parker, Fury, and Joshua. Chisora, Helenius, Franklin. Right? Dillian White has fought them all. Let me say this too, and it's interesting. You know, Dillian White, didn't look inspired in some recent fights. People thought, Dillian White has lost his fastball, so to speak. Well, here's a shocker. He's now fighting Moses Atama, and reports are that Dillian White is in top condition. Folks, as I said, while there's some fighters who are always fighting at A level, you have guys with great talent. I'll name another one, Tyson Fury. What exactly was Tyson Fury doing against Ngannou? Right? It was clear that the Tyson Fury who showed up for the Ngannou fight was not the Tyson Fury who showed up for the first Usyk fight. You have talented guys who, again, if they think their opponent's a C-level opponent, they'll come in at B-level. Right? That's the way it goes. Who exactly is Dillian White? Is he the guy who's always at A-level, whose performance has dipped because of age in his last few fights? Or is this the guy who might get inspired for an opponent who's going off at something like 8-1 or something in some books over him? Right? So, let's watch this fight. You're going to figure out early. You're going to figure out early in this fight whether it's a competitive fight. Right? Either Moses Atama is going to come across the ring, start throwing punches. He's going to look like Tyson circa 1985. Right? He's going to look like, a guy who's just stronger, faster, hits harder than his veteran opponent. Right? Either he's going to look like that, or he's going to come out and you're going to notice that Dillian White, again, Dillian White's a guy who stopped Povetkin, knocked down Joe Parker. Right? That's who Dillian White is. That's the level of punching power. I once saw an interview with Fabio Wardley, very hard puncher himself. And Wardley was asked who hit him the hardest, and he flatly talked about Dillian White's left hook. Let me say this too. When a guy's nickname is the Body Snatcher, you need to realize he has a body punching part to his game. Right? And, I personally believe that superstar trainers aren't going to stick around fighters who aren't committed. Right? Understand, Eddie Futch had a major talent. Guy who beat Holyfield twice. Riddick Bowe. And believe it or not, Eddie Futch, who of course had trained Kenny Norton, had trained Joe Frazier, right? Eddie Futch, Hall of Famer. He trained Freddie Roach. Eddie Futch left Riddick Bowe. Think about that. Right? I see Buddy McGurt in Dillian White's corner, and I know they're serious. Right? Dillian White and Buddy McGurt both know Buddy McGurt is not going to be hanging around some dude who's not serious in the gym. Right? So, the big question here today is, how does Moses Atama overcome the experience gap? Which matters. Folks, this is not a sparring session. Things count today. Right? Dillian White's an older fighter. He's not going to take this opportunity lightly. Understand, too, when a guy's a mandatory, which is who Moses Atama is, Dillian White knows that if he beats him, White is suddenly in the mix at heavyweight. Right? Let's think it through. Right? And at heavyweight, Usyk's 38 years old. There's going to be a lot of volatility at the top. Right? If Usyk were to announce that he's retiring today, 99% of the public is going to think to themselves, wow, he's had a great career. And it's a full career. Right? No one's going to think, oh my goodness, he hasn't done enough. He's retiring prematurely. Right? He's 38. He's not the 32 Hagler was when he walked away from the sport. Understand, too, Joe Parker is a mandatory contender. Right? A Joe Parker, Dillian White fight. They've already fought. Dillian White won that fight. That fight would be combustible. If Dillian White becomes heavyweight champ, there are rumors that Vladimir Klitschko wants back in. Dillian White feels, and look at the tape, you make your own decision, that the referee allowed Tyson Fury to, outside the rules, push him down. You look at the end of that Tyson Fury-Dillian White fight. In other words, Dillian White has a number of fights that would be great fights for him in terms of paying back perceived debts, strengthening his own legacy. Right? He knocked down AJ when they were amateurs. AJ, of course, stopped him when they were professionals. Both of these guys are two of the major British heavyweights of the last decade. You can imagine how interesting an AJ Dillian White fight would be. You can imagine how interesting a Dillian White Daniel Dubois fight would be. Right, folks? That road, with a lot of satisfying fights, requires Dillian White to look good today against a guy who has not made it past the 6th round. Maybe Moses Atama wins this fight, right? But this is one of those moments where, you know, I'll just say, all of us here on this website have been to sports books before or have been online at sports betting sites, and we've looked at lines in the past. Folks, I see Buddy McGurt in Dillian White's corner. I see Dillian White in great shape. I see an opponent who we don't even know, don't have the foggiest idea how he's going to do if pushed into the later rounds. And I see these betting spreads. Let's just say I'm surprised. Let's buckle up. We're going to learn a lot about the heavyweight division today. Maybe Atama comes out and keeps his reputation. Maybe Dillian White comes out and shows us that Atama is fallible. We'll find